Hi, this is James at node.js. In this episode, we'll look at serving content from Koa. We'll start by looking at how to serve static content such as CSS and image files. Then we'll look at options for serving dynamic content. There's a lot of them. Then we'll do a deep dive into Jade, one of the more popular templating languages. We'll explore and learn by creating tests, which is one of the best ways to learn a new library. Let's briefly look at how we serve content from Koajs applications. First, I'll start by creating a minimal Koajs application. To serve content from Koajs, you assign the content to the response body, either this.response.body or the alias this.body. And depending on the content, you may need to assign a content type. There are 5 types of values you can assign to the response body: strings, buffers, objects, streams, and null. Now, Koajs will automatically assign the content type, if needed, as follows. Strings default to text/plain or text/HTML, depending on the content. Buffers and streams default to application/octet stream. And objects default to application/JSON. Alright, now let's consider the types of content you'll need to serve. For static content, the easiest approach is using middleware, such as Koa Static. You can use Koa Static by passing it into the app.use method, including a directory where the static content is stored. A common approach would be having a JS directory for your JavaScript assets, as well as a CSS directory and an image directory for those types of assets. The Koa Static middleware will automatically determine most content types for you based on the file extension. So for example, if I create a public folder with a JS directory inside it, then I create an app.js file and write something in that file, then I start the Koajs server, the static middleware will automatically return the app.js file when requested with the correct path. To serve dynamically generated content, you'll want to use a library like Koajs. Koajs leverages the consolidate.js library, which gives you access to over 24 different template engines. Well, that's a lot of choices, so I'll kind of narrow down that list to a few unique ones. In the next 3 episodes, we'll look at 3 different templating languages: Jade, Swig, and the relatively new templating language, Marko. Each of these templating languages has something interesting to offer. Jade offers a very unique syntax and structure, which most developers will find pleasant to work with. Swig is a more conventional template syntax, embedded within an HTML file. It's fast and extensible. And Marko is a relatively new templating language that is similar to Swig in that it's embedded within the HTML, however, it adds some interesting features. Most interesting to me is the streaming support and the ability to render HTML out of order. This reduces the time to the first byte being received by the browser, resulting in improved real load times as well as perceived load times due to progressive rendering in the browser. Now there's a lot of content to cover, so we're going to break this up into 3 screencasts. This screencast will focus on Jade. Jade is very popular, and unlike most templating languages you'll see, it uses a terse syntax that omits closing HTML tags and instead uses white space with nested tags, similar to how Python denotes code blocks. So for instance, an unordered list in HTML would look like this. However, in Jade, you only use opening tags and indentions to nest tags within tags, and you don't use any angle brackets. The same unordered list would look like this in Jade. The result is less code to write, and even more importantly, less code to read. I think the most efficient way to explore new languages, libraries, and frameworks is by writing tests. It's the best way to test your understanding and expectations, so that's what we'll do today. I've already created a project directory and added a package.json file, using npm init. Let's start by creating a test directory. Then we'll create and open a jade.js file in our new directory. As you're probably aware, using Koajs requires the node.js harmony flag, which supports JavaScript generators, the foundational building block in Koajs. But what you may not know is that the harmony flag enables some other ECMAScript 6 features. I'm going to play with the new let keyword, which is a sibling to the var keyword. Using let in place of var gives you true block scoping versus the functional scoping, which can be very confusing. Let appears to be the general replacement for var in the near future. So we're going to use let, but in order to do that, our scripts must run in strict mode. We're going to use the assertion library that comes with Node, along with supertest for easy HTTP assertions. We'll also pull in komoka, which allows us to use generators in our tests. For our first test, let's figure out how to create an anchor with an href. Now I could pull the Jade library into our test and call Jade methods to render our templates. However, this screencasts about Jade in Koajs. So I want to render Jade and return it from a Koajs app. To achieve this goal, here's what I want to do. Using superagent, I want to send my test Koa app a Jade file name, possibly some data, and a flag to optionally log the HTML. Then my test Koa app will try and render the Jade file with the passed data, logging the HTML in a readable format to the console, then send the rendered HTML as a response to supertest. Supertest will then check for a 200 status code, and then check the HTML for some expected content. Okay, let's write our first test. In order to use supertest, we need a server to reference. Let's start by pulling in a Koajs app in a fixtures directory. This app doesn't exist yet. We'll create it in a moment. Next, we'll store the server returned by app.listen. Okay, now we're at the point where we can write our first test. Let's see if we can create an anchor tag with an href for our first test. So I'll use supertest, passing in the server. Then I'll start a post. It doesn't really matter which URL because of the way we're going to run our test. Next, I'll set my Jade file header. We'll say the file name is attributes or attr. We'll set the do-log header to true. Let's not pass any data right now, just to keep it simple to start. Next, we'll expect a 200 status code, and we'll expect the body to have some text. I can either pass a string to match against or a regular expression. We'll use a regular expression right now, and check that the body has an href equal to nothen.com. Lastly, I'll call end. Let's run our test by calling Mocha with the harmony flag. I'm expecting it to fail, and it does because it can't find packages we're referencing. All right, let's install our dependencies using npm install. Let's run our test again, and it fails this time because it can't find our test app. Let's create that app. I'll start by creating a fixtures directory, then I'll create and open an app.js file in Sublime. We're going to pull in Koa, and next we'll use Koajs to render our template. We'll need to parse the request to get the passed data, so we'll use kobody for that. Now we'll instantiate a Koa app. Then we'll create a returning middleware by passing a generator into the app.use method. I want to create 4 variables. File name to store the file name passed in from the header, data to store the post data, body to store the rendered HTML, and do-log to store the do-log flag passed in the header as well. Let's grab the file name and the log flag from the header. Next, let's grab any post data that was sent. Now we need to render our Jade template, but there's a bit of setup we need to do first. We'll create a render variable that will store a function returned by Koview. I'll pass in 2 things, the base directory to look for Jade files, and the default file extension. Now we'll set our body, which should be HTML, by calling the render function, passing in the file name, and any local variables we want available to the Jade templating engine. Then we'll need to conditionally log the rendered HTML, just for our convenience while learning. Let's create a log function for this that takes the content parameter. The HTML that Jade renders won't have any unnecessary white space, which is optimal when served, but makes it kind of hard to read. Let's pull in a module called HTML that has a pretty print function. Let's also pull in the colors module so that when we log our HTML to the console, we can do it with colors. Now we can prettify the HTML and log it with colors to the console. Okay, now we can call the log function, passing in the rendered HTML. Next, we'll set the response body to the rendered HTML. Okay, let's export our app. Okay, we need to install the new modules we're referencing with npm install. All right, let's run our test again. We've got a new error. The app can't find our Jade file, which doesn't exist yet. Let's create a Jade directory and an attr.jade file and open it with Sublime. As I showed you earlier, we can specify an HTML tag by keying the tag without the angle brackets. So in our case, we'll enter an A for anchor with the parentheses containing the attributes of the tag. The test's looking for an href, so we'll key in href equals nothen.com. Let's save the file and run our test, and it works. Let's take a closer look at the content in the console. Yeah, it looks good. Okay, there was quite a bit of setup just to get our first test working. But hang with me, our subsequent tests should be a lot faster. Jade has a few syntax shortcuts for commonly used HTML attributes. Following the CSS selector syntax, we can assign a class to an HTML tag by using the .className syntax. For instance, if I wanted to assign the class screencast, I would put .screencast after the A. I can assign multiple classes by repeating the dot notation. The ID attribute can be assigned by keying #ID name. For other attributes, I can just include them in the parentheses, separating them with commas. Let's move on to our next test. This test should render a passed variable in the template and have it show up in the HTML. I'll start by creating and assigning a name variable. Just like before, we'll use supertest, call post, set the Jade file to vars, set the logging flag. This time we'll send the name variable and specify our expectations. Okay, this is pretty verbose and very repetitive. Let's write a helper function to make things a little cleaner. We'll call the function testHelper that takes the Jade file name, the expected string or regular expression in the returned HTML, the logging flag, and any data that should get sent to the app. Then we'll just default the data and make our HTTP assertions. Now we'll refactor our two tests to use this helper function. Let's make sure the first test still passes, and it does. Now we need to create our vars Jade file. To assign the value of a variable within the template to a tag, we use the equal operator. Let's run our test. Looks good, but we should stop logging the first test. I'll pass the false flag to the test helper. That didn't work. Oh, my boolean's being converted to a string. Yeah, maybe not the best approach. Okay, for now, let's just check if the do-log is the string true. Let's rerun our test. Yeah, that looks better. We could also use the string interpolation syntax, which is similar to Ruby. Okay, running our test. Looks good. What about potentially dangerous user content? Well, Jade escapes the content by default, so let's test that. I'll create a couple variables, user content and escaped user content. Then I'll initialize the user content to a script tag. Next, I want to escape the user content in my test and use it for comparison to what Jade returns. I'll pull in the escape HTML module into my test file. Now we'll assign the escaped user content to the value returned by calling the new escape function and passing in the user content. Now we'll call our test helper using the same Jade file name, vars, that was used in the last test. We'll install our escape HTML module using npm. Now let's run our test, and it passes. Now let's look at iteration in Jade. Our test will render a list of websites. So we'll start by creating an array. Then we'll call our test helper specifying the loop Jade file, our test criteria, we'll set logging to true, and lastly passing in our array. We'll run this test 3 times, each time checking one of the array elements. Running our test fails. Now let's write our loop.jade file. We'll create an unordered list, then we'll loop through our array using the each syntax and assign a list item to the website. Let's save our file and run our test. Looks good. Jade offers case logic. We'll create a test to see if it's safe for someone to drive after having varying numbers of drinks. The first test will be when 0 drinks are consumed. Let's call the test helper, passing in the file name, the test expression, the logging indicator, and the drinks consumed. Our test fails. Let's create our Jade file. The syntax is case followed by the variable, then successive when criteria. I'll write a few scenarios. Now run our test, and it looks good. Let's write a test for when 1 drink has been consumed. And looks good. Now a test for 3 drinks. And looks good. And one final test for 10 drinks. And it works. The next test will look at conditional logic in Jade. We'll show an anchor that displays login if there is no user variable, or log out when there is a user. The first test won't pass any data. Now let's make our conditional Jade file. The syntax is a simple if statement without the need for parentheses. Let's save our file, run our test. Looks good. Now let's create a similar test when there is a user. Running our test, and it passes. Jade has a couple of different kinds of comments, buffered and unbuffered. In other words, do the comments get passed to the rendered HTML or not? Let's write a buffered test. We'll call our test helper, passing in the comment Jade file name, the test expression followed by the logging indicator. Running our test fails. Let's create our comment.jade file. A buffered comment is just 2 forward slashes followed by a comment. An unbuffered comment is 2 forward slashes and a hyphen followed by a comment. Let's save the file and rerun our test, and it works. Now let's test to make sure the unbuffered comment isn't passed. I could write some crazy regex, but I'd rather not, so let's just check for the string that should be there, knowing it should throw an error. Then we'll catch the error and test that the error message matches what we expect. Not the most elegant test, but it'll do for now. And it passes. Jade supports block comments by using the comment syntax and indenting the comments on subsequent lines. Let's write a test for 2-line block comment. Running our test fails. Let's create our block comment.jade file and enter our block comment. And now our test passes. Jade supports template inheritance, where a child template can reference a parent template and optionally override parts of the parent. Let's test that. Our first test will create a parent file with a block that can be overridden but provides a default value when it isn't overridden. The file will be parent.jade, and the test will be for the words default content. And running this test fails. Now let's create the parent file. The keyword to use is block followed by an identifier. Then within the block, we'll put a p tag with default content. Let's save our file and run our test again, and it passes. Now let's create a test for a child template that inherits from the last parent.jade file. The Jade file name will be child. The test will be for the child content. Running our test fails. Let's create the child.jade file. In the child.jade file, we will tell Jade to extend the parent.jade file. Then we'll use the block keyword with the block identifier in the parent file that we wish to override. We'll use a p tag with the text child content. Now running our test, and it works. Another feature in Jade is the ability to import or include one file into another file. So in this test, we'll pass in the Jade file name include, then we'll test for a string that should be included from a separate Jade file. Our test fails. Now let's create an include.jade file. To include a file, you use the include keyword followed by the Jade file to include. We'll reference head.jade. Now let's create our head.jade file and include the content we're testing for. Running our test again, and it works. Jade includes some shortcuts for document types. You can see the full list on the Jade homepage. Let's test for the HTML5 doc type. Our Jade file will be doc type. Our test will be the HTML5 doc type. Running our test fails. Let's create our doc type Jade file. The syntax is doc type HTML. Okay, let's save our file and running our test again, and it works. Jade allows you to create mixins, which is a way to create reusable Jade blocks. Let's create a favlink mixin that renders an anchor with favorite class. The Jade file name is mixin. We'll test for the anchor. The test fails. Let's create our mixin.jade file. Two things about mixins. You define the mixin using the mixin keyword, followed by the mixin name and any parameters it can take. Then you write the returned Jade from the mixin. The syntax to call the mixin is the plus sign followed by the mixin name. Let's save our file and run our test, and it passes. Okay, only a couple more tests and then one more final comprehensive example. Jade can render plain text. Let's look at that. The Jade file name will be text. The test will be the expression plain text. Running our test fails. Now let's create our Jade file. We use the pipe operator to indicate text will follow. Let's save our file and run our test. Looks good. Jade allows you to render a block of text using the dot after the tag, then putting your text in an indented block below the tag. Let's write a test for that. The Jade file name will be block text. Our test expression will be a p tag split on 2 lines. Running our test fails. Let's create our block text Jade file. We'll use the dot syntax, then key our block content. Let's save our file, running our test again, and it passes. Okay, one final more comprehensive test. We'll create a few Jade files that incorporate several of the features we've tested today. Our test will call for a Jade file named index, then we'll pass in our test expression. We'll enable logging and pass in an object with several properties that will be used in our Jade files. We'll pass a title to be used in the parent.jade file. we'll pass in a pros and cons property of using Jade. Of course, our test fails. Let's write our Jade files. We'll start with the parent file, which we'll name layout.jade. The title will be based on the title variable passed into Jade. In the body, we'll include a header.jade file. Then we'll set up an overridable block called content. Then we'll include a scripts.jade file. Next, we'll write our header.jade file, which just has a nav tag and some links. Then we'll write our script.jade file, which includes a script tag. Now let's create an index.jade file that inherits or extends layout.jade. Then we'll override the content block, writing an h tag, then listing the pros and cons of Jade in an unordered list. Let's save and run our last test. And it works. Well, that covers a good portion of the features in Jade and how to render Jade in Koa. I hope it's been helpful. Please consider joining my mailing list so I can notify you when new screencasts are available. Stay tuned for the next couple episodes where we'll look at Swig and Marko. Thanks. Goodbye.